The frozen valley lay under a grim sky, its stillness broken only by the cries of the wounded. Two sisters, snipers in the Russian military, watched through their scopes, their hearts racing as they observed the chaos unfolding below. Lieutenant Sarah Ivankov, the elder of the two, tightened her grip on the rifle, her finger itching to pull the trigger. Her sister, Corporal Elena Ivankov, lay beside her, the two women sharing a quiet bond forged over years of military service. Orders from above had been clear. Stay silent, stay still. But the valley had become a kill zone, and 300 soldiers were dying. Command had made their decision, too risky, they said. The air support was grounded, reinforcements hours away. The Ivankov sisters knew better. They had learned the value of loyalty, of sacrifice, and of never leaving anyone behind. The decision to disobey came easily. Sarah spoke first, her voice barely audible through the comms, request permission to engage. The silence from their commander stretched on, too long, as they watched the enemy closing in. Finally, Major Ivanov's voice crackled through the radio, cold and dispassionate. Negative, hold your position, do not engage. They had heard the order, they had heard the logic. But the truth was simple. If they stayed silent, if they held back, 300 soldiers would be left to die. And that, they knew, was not an option. Without a word, both snipers switched their radios off. Sarah looked at Elena, their eyes meeting in perfect understanding. "We do this together," Sarah whispered. Elena nodded, steadying her rifle as the two snipers, isolated on the northern ridge, prepared to make a choice that could end their careers, or define them forever. The valley below was waiting, filled with the silent screams of soldiers struggling to survive. As the enemy massed their forces, Sarah's breath slowed. She counted the enemy artillery positions, the mortar crews, the commanders issuing orders from the back of the assault. "This is it," Sarah said softly. "We stop them now." Together, they focused their sights. 2 rifles, 300 lives hanging in the balance. Sarah's heartbeat synced with the rhythm of the snow beneath her feet. The command was clear: save them or let them fall. Her finger found the trigger. "One," she whispered. Her rifle spoke. The sharp crack of Sarah's rifle cut through the frozen air, a clean shot that dropped the first enemy officer in his tracks. The chaos in the valley below shifted as the sound of sniper fire reached the Marines struggling beneath. Elena's shot followed milliseconds later, a perfect strike against a mortar spotter. The enemy, oblivious until now, began to fragment, confusion rippling through their ranks. Sarah and Elena remained still, their rifles smoking slightly in the cold, their minds already calculating their next move. Every shot counted, every round a potential lifeline for the Marines below. Sarah's radio buzzed, the voice of Major Ivanov again. "You've disobeyed direct orders, Ivankov. What the hell do you think you're doing?" The anger in his voice was palpable, but there was no backing down now. Sarah's response was simple, measured. "Saving lives, sir." The silence on the other end lasted for several seconds before the static returned. "If you're going rogue, you'll face the consequences," Ivanov snapped. "Understood, sir," Sarah replied, cutting the communication. Her focus returned to the valley. The assault had stalled, and for the first time, the Marines below had a moment to breathe. Sarah and Elena exchanged a glance, their expressions hardened, knowing that their actions would soon echo through the chain of command. But there was no turning back. With each shot they took, each life they saved, the reality of their insubordination became undeniable. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was the men on the ground. Elena shifted position, her rifle steady in her hands. "We need to clear those mortars. They're adjusting fire," she said, her voice unwavering. Sarah scanned the ridge, locating the next target, a commander waving orders to his troops. Without hesitation, she fired. The man collapsed, his control over the assault slipping away. But the enemy adapted quickly, and soon Sarah spotted movement near the southern ridge. Enemy scouts were on the move, likely trying to locate the snipers who had begun to break their lines. "They're sending scouts," Sarah warned Elena. "Stay alert." Elena nodded, her eyes never leaving her scope. The sisters moved silently, each shot ringing out with a finality that altered the course of the battle. But they knew their window of opportunity was narrowing. The enemy was learning. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and the faint sting of gunpowder. The Marines below, barely holding on, were about to face a second wave, and the Ivankov sisters would be their shield. "We've got about 5 minutes before they regroup," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "Let's make them count." The enemy's assault was coming. Sarah could see it, feel it in the tension of the wind, in the way the soldiers below began to move with greater purpose. The ground trembled as enemy forces massed on the southern approach. The Ivankov sisters knew that their time was running out. Their rifles had become a lifeline for the Marines, but they couldn't hold off an entire army with just 2 guns and dwindling ammunition. The cold had numbed their hands, but it had sharpened their focus. Every breath, every heartbeat, every shot had to matter. Through her scope, Sarah saw the enemy preparing for another attack. A technical truck, mounted with a heavy machine gun, rolled into position. The gunners had clear lines of fire aimed directly at the Marine positions. If that truck opened fire, it would tear through the Marines' defenses like paper. Sarah gritted her teeth, calculating the distance. 2,300 meters, she muttered to herself. The wind had shifted, and with it the difficulty of the shot increased. She looked over at Elena, who was already preparing her rifle. "You can make it," Sarah said, her voice steady. Elena didn't respond immediately, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had trained for this moment their entire life. She adjusted the scope, measured the wind, and then, without a word, she settled into position. Sarah watched as Elena took the shot, her breath held in anticipation. The crack of the rifle echoed in the stillness, and then confirmation. The gunner in the truck dropped, his body falling limp. The truck's crew scattered in panic, but Sarah knew the cost. The shot had been perfect, but it had cost them a precious round. They had only 21 shots left between them. Sarah switched to the emergency channel, her voice calm but urgent. "Guardian Angel, Convoy 6, enemy retreating from the southern approach. We've disrupted their fire, but we need reinforcements. How are you holding up?" The response was immediate, a voice tinged with exhaustion. "We're still here, Guardian Angel, but we need you to keep it up. We've got wounded, 32, 14 critical, no reinforcements for at least 8 hours. Sarah's heart sank. 8 hours. That was an eternity in the middle of a firefight. But she didn't let the thought linger. "We will hold as long as we can," Sarah said firmly. "Just stay alive." As she finished speaking, a new voice cut through the static. "You've bought us time, but how long can you keep this up?" It was Captain Walsh, the leader of Convoy 6. Sarah checked her ammunition once again. They were down to 21 rounds, not enough, but they wouldn't stop until they had no choice. "We'll hold until you're safe," Sarah replied. She exchanged a glance with Elena, who nodded, her eyes steady with resolve. The assault had been broken, but the war was far from over. They would fight for as long as they had breath left in their bodies. The Marines below needed them. And the Ivankov sisters would not falter. The silence between the Ivankov sisters was broken only by the sound of their breathing and the distant rumble of enemy movement below. They had successfully disrupted the assault for now, but the enemy was regrouping, learning from their mistakes. Sarah scanned the ridge through her scope, searching for the next target, her mind racing through calculations. The southern ridge was lined with enemies preparing for another attack, their formation tight and determined. The Ivankov sisters had just enough ammunition to make one more stand. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated, but they weren't out of options. "They'll hit us with everything they have now," Sarah murmured, her voice tight with the weight of what was coming. "We need to focus on the command structure, take out the leaders." Elena, always the steadier of the two, nodded. "We'll need to be quick." They had no illusions left. They could feel the eyes of the enemy drawing closer, their scouts likely aware of their positions by now. But the Ivankov sisters had learned long ago that fear was a distraction. It had no place on the battlefield. They had made their peace with what they had chosen, what they would do, what they would become. Their mission was clear: protect the Marines below, eliminate the enemy, and survive. "Ready?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, as she settled her eye to the scope once more. "Always," Elena replied. The sisters moved in perfect sync. Each shot was calculated, each movement seamless as they eliminated high-value targets. Enemy commanders, artillery coordinators, anything that could disrupt the Marines' last stand. The battle below was shifting. The enemy was beginning to lose cohesion, their assault becoming more erratic as their leaders fell one by one. Below, the Marines fought with renewed purpose, empowered by the sniper's unseen hand. Sarah fired again, taking out another officer, and then Elena took down a machine gunner attempting to set up a strongpoint. Each shot disrupted the enemy's plan further, each sniper's bullet a small but critical act of defiance. But Sarah could feel the toll it was taking. The cold was biting, her fingers stiff with frostbite, and the dwindling supply of ammunition weighed heavily on her mind. They were nearing their limit. The enemy would be on them soon, and their time was running out. "We've got maybe 2 more shots left," Sarah said, checking her rifle. "After that, we'll be out." "Then we make them count," Elena replied calmly. The sniper sisters had never shied away from the impossible. Their bond, their training, and their loyalty to the Marines below gave them the strength to keep going when others would have faltered. But even they knew that the final assault would require more than they had left. "We need to move," Sarah said, seeing the enemy regaining momentum. "They're adjusting their positions. If we stay too long, they'll pinpoint us." "Agreed," Elena responded. And with that, the sisters began to shift their positions, always moving with the quiet precision of professionals. They were running out of time, but there was still one final fight to be had. "How much longer?" Sarah asked as they adjusted their scopes one last time. "As long as we can," Elena said. They had one more shot at saving the Marines, and they would take it, no matter the cost. The assault came as expected. The enemy had regrouped, their forces now larger, more disciplined, and more determined to finish what they had started. Sarah and Elena could see them moving into position from their new vantage point on the eastern ridge. This time, the Ivankov sisters wouldn't have the element of surprise. The battle was entering its final phase, and they were at the heart of it. The cold was unbearable now, but the sisters had long since stopped feeling it. They had one focus, the Marines below. Sarah's finger twitched against the trigger. She had only 10 rounds left. "They're coming," Elena said quietly. "We can't keep this up much longer." Sarah didn't answer immediately, her eyes trained on the advancing enemy. The wind carried the sound of their movements toward them, and she could see them, hundreds of enemy fighters advancing across the valley floor. The Marines below were holding their ground, but Sarah knew that they were about to face an overwhelming wave. Their line would break soon, unless she and Elena made their last shots count. "We have one chance to slow them down," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. She adjusted her position slightly, eyeing the enemy commanders organizing the assault. The first officer, raising his hand to signal the start of the charge, was her target. She steadied her breath, held her aim, and then, "3," she whispered. A sharp crack echoed in the cold, and the officer dropped without a sound. The assault faltered for a moment, the confusion rippling through the enemy ranks as they looked for leadership. Elena's shot followed seconds later, another officer falling to the ground. For a brief moment, it seemed like the tide of battle had shifted, but Sarah knew it wouldn't last long. "We've got maybe one more shot each," Sarah said, eyeing the enemy's movements. They were learning, adapting, and starting to reorganize their assault. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The sisters worked in perfect sync, each taking out high-value targets, snipers, machine gun teams, officers directing the attack. Every shot they took disrupted the enemy's plans, but Sarah felt the weight of each one. They were running low on ammo, and the enemy's numbers were still overwhelming. "They're going to push forward soon," Elena said, checking her rifle. "We can't hold them off forever." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving the battlefield below. The Marines were still holding, but their strength was starting to wane. The enemy was closing in, and their final push would come soon. "We need to make it count," Sarah said, gripping her rifle tighter. She checked her remaining rounds. 7. Elena had 6. It wasn't enough. But they had no choice. They would fight until they couldn't anymore. The next wave of the enemy assault began, a massive surge of fighters charging forward under cover of smoke. The Ivankov sisters took their final shots, hitting their targets with deadly accuracy. But the assault kept coming. The Marines, holding on with everything they had, were about to be overrun. "Get ready," Sarah said, her voice calm but tense. "This is the last push." The sisters reloaded their rifles, prepared for the inevitable. But just as the enemy reached the Marine perimeter, a new sound filled the air. Helicopters. We've got air support inbound. Sarah's heart leapt. She looked up to see 4 Apache gunships coming over the eastern ridge, followed by transport helicopters. The cavalry had arrived. The enemy scattered in panic as the Apache helicopters unleashed a hail of gunfire and rockets, tearing through the enemy ranks. The assault collapsed, and Sarah and Elena stood frozen for a moment, watching as the battlefield transformed from chaos to near silence. The Marines below, who had been on the brink of destruction, began to cheer, but the sisters remained silent, their eyes scanning for any remaining threats. The battle wasn't over yet. Sarah looked at Elena, her face pale from exhaustion, but her eyes steady. "We did it," Elena whispered. "We saved them." Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The Marines were alive. That was all that mattered. But what would happen to them now? The helicopters landed to evacuate the wounded, but Sarah and Elena knew they wouldn't be joining them. Their orders had been clear: disobey orders and the consequences would follow. They had known that from the start. But for now they had done what they had promised. No Marine left behind. As the dust settled and the helicopters began to lift the wounded from the battlefield, the Ivankov sisters sat in silence, their rifles resting in their laps. The battle was over. The enemy had retreated, their assault broken by the combined might of the Marines and the deadly precision of 2 snipers who had dared to defy orders. But the victory was bittersweet. Sarah and Elena both knew that they had crossed a line. Disobeying orders in the heat of battle was a crime, no matter the outcome. They had saved 300 Marines, but in doing so, they had jeopardized their careers, their future. The sound of helicopter blades fading in the distance brought a sobering realization. They would face the consequences of their actions. Sarah turned to Elena, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. "We did the right thing, didn't we?" Elena met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "We did what had to be done. It was the only choice." Sarah nodded, but the weight of the situation lingered. "But it wasn't enough to just survive. We're not going to walk away from this without paying a price." "I know," Elena said quietly. "But saving them, that's what matters. They'll remember us." "Not just us," Sarah replied. "They'll remember every Marine who was still alive because we made that choice." The 2 sisters sat for a while longer, the cold creeping back into their bones as they watched the final remnants of the enemy retreat. The Marines below, their saviors unknown to them, began to regroup, tending to the wounded, preparing for the next phase of the war. Sarah could see Captain Walsh moving among them, his demeanor calm but authoritative. The man who had led the Marines through hell, who had survived because of the choices they made. And yet, Sarah knew the question would linger. Would it have been worth it? Their insubordination had saved lives, but at what cost? The military didn't tolerate defiance. It didn't forgive insubordination, no matter how noble the reason. Their careers were finished, of that Sarah was sure. But as the minutes passed and the Marines began to fortify their position, Sarah's resolve hardened. They had done the right thing, and no amount of punishment could change that. The sounds of the battlefield faded as the helicopters left, and Sarah and Elena were left alone in the cold, their thoughts heavy with the consequences of their actions. The Marines below would survive, thanks to their choice. But for the Ivankov sisters, the future was uncertain. They had defied orders to save lives, and in the process, they had become the story of the day. But what would that story cost them? The reality of their actions loomed large. The court-martial, the charges, the dishonorable discharge, they were coming. But they were ready to face whatever came next. "Let's go," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "We've done what we could." Together they stood, their eyes scanning the horizon one last time, ready to face the consequences, no matter what they might be. They had saved the Marines. That would have to be enough. The weeks that followed felt like a blur. Sarah and Elena were kept in separate rooms, their interrogations intense and unyielding. They were questioned repeatedly, asked the same questions over and over again, as though the officers believed they would crack under the pressure. But neither of the Ivankov sisters showed any sign of breaking. They told the truth, nothing more, nothing less. They had disobeyed orders because they had believed in something greater than the military hierarchy. They had believed in saving lives, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The court-martial was a long and exhausting process. The charges were read: insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, unauthorized engagement with the enemy. The evidence against them was clear. They had violated orders, they had acted against the chain of command, but the testimony that followed was unexpected. Major Ivanov, the officer who had given the original orders to hold their position, testified first. His words were professional, impersonal. He confirmed the orders he had given and the defiance of those orders by Sarah and Elena. It was the same testimony that was expected. But then Captain Walsh took the stand. "I don't know what these two women were thinking," Walsh began, his voice steady and clear, "but I can tell you one thing. They saved every man in my convoy. Without them, we would have all been dead." His words were simple but powerful. He went on to explain the situation they had been in, the hopelessness of the position, and the timely arrival of the sniper fire that had disrupted the enemy's assault. "They saved 300 lives," Walsh continued, "mine included, and I will not let anyone forget that." It was the first sign of support Sarah and Elena had received since the battle. The room was silent as Walsh finished his testimony, and then, one by one, every surviving Marine from the convoy stood to testify in their favor. Each man spoke of the two snipers who had saved them, who had given them a fighting chance when all seemed lost. They had no idea who the sisters were, no idea that they had defied orders to help them. But they knew one thing for certain. Without Sarah and Elena Ivankov, they would have been dead. The testimony continued for hours, each Marine telling the same story. And for the first time since their arrest, Sarah and Elena began to feel a glimmer of hope. But the panel remained stoic. The military didn't tolerate insubordination, even if it had saved hundreds of lives. As the closing arguments were presented, Sarah stood before the panel of officers, her voice calm but unwavering. "We did what we had to do," she said. "We saved them because it was the right thing to do. We didn't act for glory, and we didn't act for recognition. We acted because we had the ability to make a difference, and we couldn't stand by and watch our brothers in arms die while we did nothing." The room was quiet as Sarah finished speaking, her words hanging in the air. The panel conferred briefly before the presiding officer spoke. "Lieutenant Ivankov, Corporal Ivankov, this panel finds you guilty of all charges. However, in recognition of your actions during the battle, this panel recommends you both be awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat." The room erupted in shock and disbelief. Sarah and Elena exchanged a brief look. They had expected to be sentenced to a dishonorable discharge, to lose everything they had worked for. But the Navy Cross, the highest honor they could receive, had been recommended. The consequences of their actions would still be felt. They would be reprimanded, their records marked with a permanent stain of insubordination. But for the Marines who had survived, for the men they had saved, Sarah and Elena would be remembered not for their disobedience, but for their courage, their loyalty, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for the lives of others. The judgment was clear. They were heroes, even in the face of the military's cold, unyielding rules. And as the court-martial concluded, Sarah and Elena walked out of the room, their heads held high. They had done what was right, and that was all that mattered. 6 months later, Sarah and Elena found themselves on a different ridge, in a different country, with a new war on the horizon. The military had moved them from one conflict to the next, as they had always done with soldiers who proved themselves under fire. But the Ivankov sisters, despite their record, were not celebrated. The reprimands in their service records ensured they would never rise through the ranks. They were no longer the promising snipers they once were. They were now marked by their defiance. And yet, they remained loyal to the Marine Corps, to each other, and to the very values that had made them defy orders in the first place. The battlefield was a familiar place, even in a foreign land. Sarah set up her scope, her mind automatically focusing on the distant threat. 2 targets, northeast quadrant, range 1,800 meters, Elena said, her voice calm as ever. "I've got the left target." Sarah acknowledged, adjusting her own rifle. The years of training, of fighting side by side, had not dulled their abilities. The military may have sought to break them, to label them as traitors, but they had only grown stronger. "On your count," Sarah said, her finger already resting lightly on the trigger. 3. The sound of 2 long-range rifle shots broke the silence of the valley. The targets fell. 2 more enemies taken down before they could even reach the Marine patrol below. For a brief moment, the sisters allowed themselves to feel a sense of satisfaction. The mission had gone as planned, their shots clean, their work done. "Clear," Sarah said softly, lowering her rifle and scanning the horizon once again. "We did our part," Elena responded. There was no need to say more. They had made their peace with the consequences of their actions, and now they were doing what they had always done, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The Marines below would never know their names. They would never understand the sacrifices Sarah and Elena had made to keep them alive. But it didn't matter. The sisters had learned that sometimes the bravest act was not seeking recognition or reward, but simply doing what was right, no matter the cost. The helicopters would come for the Marines below, and when they did, Sarah and Elena would disappear into the shadows once again, unnoticed, uncelebrated. But they would always know what they had done, and that was enough. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the valley, Sarah glanced at Elena. Her sister's face was expressionless, as always, but Sarah could see the flicker of something in her eyes. Something they both shared, something unspoken. They had made the choice to fight for what was right, to never leave a Marine behind. And no matter the cost, that would always define who they were. "We're done here," Sarah said. "Let's move." Together, they packed up their gear, the cold night air biting at their skin. But neither of them noticed it. They were focused on the mission, and that, for them, was everything. The Marine Corps may have stripped them of everything they once had, but they couldn't take away the one thing that mattered: their bond, their loyalty, and their unwavering belief that they had done what was right. As they moved out, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Reinforcements had arrived. The Marines below were safe, for now. But the Ivankov sisters knew that their work was never truly finished. They would always be watching, always waiting, always ready to make the hardest choice in order to do the right thing. Because sometimes doing what was right meant breaking the rules. The Ivankov sisters found themselves back in their quarters after the operation, their bodies worn and battered by the cold, the stress, and the memories of the battles they had fought together. The work was far from over. The military had moved them yet again, but their roles had changed. Their insubordination had marked them as outcasts, but it had also shaped them into something different, something more. They were no longer just snipers in the Russian army. They were women who had defied the very structure that was supposed to define them. Their punishment had been swift. The reprimands in their records were permanent, and the Navy Cross, a symbol of their courage, would never undo the decisions they had made. But those decisions had saved lives. And now, as they sat in the dimly lit room, neither Sarah nor Elena felt regret. The walls were silent, the weight of the silence pressing on them like a heavy blanket. It was as though the world had forgotten their names, forgotten their actions. Their names would never be spoken in the halls of the military with the same reverence as the heroes who followed orders, who stayed within the lines. But the sisters knew the truth. Their heroism was not defined by medals or public praise. It was defined by the lives they had saved, by the bond they shared, and by the choice they had made when it mattered most. They had defied orders, but they had never defied the code that had always guided them: loyalty to their fellow Marines and to each other. "It's quiet now," Elena said, her voice low as she looked out the window. "Too quiet," Sarah replied, rubbing her face with a weary hand. The mission was over, but the consequences were far from finished. They both knew that soon enough they would be called in for the final reckoning. The court-martial, the disciplinary hearings, the inevitable consequences of their actions. But for now, there was only the silence of the room and the constant reminder that the battlefield never truly ended. "We did what we had to do," Sarah said, more to herself than to Elena. Her voice was firm, unwavering. It was the only choice. Elena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out the window, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before. "What happens next?" Sarah didn't have an answer. They had already made their choice. They had already defied the orders. Now they would have to face the consequences of that choice. It was inevitable, but they were still sisters, and that bond, forged in battle and sealed by the hardships they had endured, would see them through whatever came next. "We face it," Sarah said, her voice steady and sure. "Together." The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Sarah and Elena turned to face the door. They had been expecting this. It was time to face the music. But as they stood together, facing whatever came next, there was no fear. Only the knowledge that they had done what was right, and that, no matter what, would always be enough. The door opened. Major Ivanov stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. He motioned for them to follow. It was time. Sarah and Elena walked down the narrow hallway, the echo of their boots against the cold floor, the only sound in the sterile, dimly lit corridor. It was a walk they both knew too well. The military never forgot, and neither did the weight of their decision. They had defied orders to save lives, but now they were about to face the consequences of that defiance. The court-martial was inevitable, but they had already made peace with it. They had done the right thing, and sometimes doing the right thing meant facing punishment. The door to the room opened with a soft click. Major Ivanov stood at the entrance, his face impassive as he gestured for them to enter. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, each of them carrying the weight of authority. The panel looked at Sarah and Elena with a mix of skepticism and respect. There was no anger, no judgment. They had saved 300 Marines, but they had also violated the chain of command. The question was whether their actions had been justified. Lieutenant Ivankov, Corporal Ivankov, the presiding officer began, his voice steady but formal. You stand before this panel to answer for your insubordination during the recent operation. You disobeyed direct orders to stand down and engage the enemy without authorization. Your actions, while heroic, constitute a clear violation of military protocol. The words hung in the air, but Sarah didn't flinch. She had known what this moment would be like. It had been coming since the day they made their decision. We did what we had to do, Sarah said, her voice unwavering. We saved lives. That was our mission. The room fell silent. The panel exchanged looks, as if they were weighing the gravity of her words. It wasn't about heroism or medals. It was about the decision to put others before themselves, to risk everything for the sake of those in need. Do you understand the consequences of your actions? The officer asked. Yes, sir, Elena replied, her voice steady, but there was no fear in it. She knew what was coming. They both did. And are you prepared to accept them? The question was simple, but its implications were enormous. We're prepared, Sarah answered. The presiding officer nodded, then leaned back in his chair. In recognition of your actions, this panel recommends that you both be awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. The room was silent for a long moment. The words didn't sink in at first, as though they didn't quite match the severity of the situation. Sarah and Elena exchanged a quick glance, but neither of them spoke. They had saved 300 lives, but this would cost them. They knew that the Navy Cross would never erase the mark of insubordination from their records. But they also knew that it would mean something more than a medal. It would mean that, for the first time, their actions had been recognized, not just by their fellow Marines, but by the very institution they had sworn loyalty to. However, the presiding officer continued, you will also be formally reprimanded for your actions. Your records will reflect this, and you will face disciplinary action. The consequences of insubordination cannot be ignored. Sarah nodded, accepting the judgment with the same resolve she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. The battle was over. The consequences were here. Understood, sir, she said, her voice steady. The room remained silent as the officers conferred, the weight of the moment settling over the entire room. When they spoke again, their decision was final. You will be granted the Navy Cross for your heroism, but you will also face the consequences of your insubordination. Your careers will be marked by this, but you will not be dishonorably discharged. The weight of their words hung in the air. Sarah and Elena stood still, processing the news. They had made their choice. They had faced the consequences. And in the end, they had won something: respect, recognition, and the knowledge that they had done the right thing. The officers stood, the panel adjourned, and Sarah and Elena left the room. The consequences of their actions had been laid out before them, but as they walked down the hallway side by side, they knew that they had made a difference, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. As they walked out into the cold, dark night, Sarah looked at Elena. We did what we had to do, And now we live with it. Elena nodded, her expression unreadable but resolute. Together. They didn't need to say more. The world would remember them for what they had done, for the lives they had saved. But the real victory was knowing that they had never wavered from their values. And in the end, that was enough. The helicopter that arrived to take them to their next assignment wasn't for a medical evacuation, it was for military police. But Sarah and Elena didn't fear what was coming next. They had made their choice. And sometimes that was all you could do.